The core of Berkeley's first argument is found in section 4. The argument runs something like this. Premise 1 says that sensible objects are things we perceive. Now Berkeley states this by way of a rhetorical question when he asks, what are the aforementioned objects? He means houses, mountains, rivers, and in a word, all sensible objects. What are they but the things we perceive by sense? And he's already argued for this point also in section 3. When we say that some sensible object exists, he says, there's nothing else we could even mean by exist except is perceivable. For sensible objects, to be is to be perceived, or as he says it in Latin, their esse is percipi. Here's how he explains this thought. The table that I write on, I say, exists. That is, I see and feel it. And if I were out of my study, I should say it existed, meaning thereby that if I was in my study, I might perceive it, or that some other spirit actually does perceive it. There was an odor, that is, it was smelled. There was a sound, that is to say, it was heard. A color or figure, and it was perceived by sight or touch. This is all that I can understand by these and the like expressions. So for Berkeley, it's true simply by definition that sensible objects are things we perceive. Now premise 2 says that we perceive only ideas. Berkeley has already stipulated this in section 1, where he says that all the objects of human knowledge are ideas. Ideas are the only things that can be in our minds at all. Whatever is not an idea is not something that we can perceive or know. So premise 3 follows logically from these first two premises, therefore sensible objects are only ideas. Premise 4 says that ideas cannot exist unperceived. Again, Berkeley has already stipulated back in section 2 that the existence of an idea consists in being perceived. His thought is that ideas don't just float around in the world detached from minds. They only exist in minds. Somebody has to be having an idea in order for it to exist. This goes for our sensory ideas too. Your visual perception of the computer screen doesn't hover nearby around your head until you're ready to have it, or leave the room after you're done looking at the computer. It only exists in the mind of a person who is having that perception. But it follows from premises 3 and 4 that therefore sensible objects cannot exist unperceived. Your computer is just your idea of your computer, and it doesn't exist when you're not perceiving it. Now at this point, if you're following, you're probably thinking, that's crazy. My computer and my perception of the computer are two totally different things. My computer keeps on existing even when nobody's looking at it. Berkeley knows that's what you're thinking, and he has an answer. In section 5, he argues that you can't even conceive of an unperceived object. You literally have no idea what you're talking about here. This is what he says. He says, premise 1 says, we can conceive separately only such objects as it is possible may really exist or be actually perceived asunder. Berkeley thinks that we can only conceive of things that we could actually perceive with our senses if they existed. Obviously, we can conceive of things that do exist and that we've seen, like our own hands and feet, say. And we can conceive of things that do exist but that we haven't seen, like, say, the molten hot core of the earth. And we can conceive of things that could possibly have existed but don't exist in our actual world, like unicorns, or an earth without pollution, or great Ethiopian restaurants in Greenville. Berkeley seems to think that when we conceive of any of these things, we're forming a picture of it in our minds. And if we can form a mental picture of it, then we could also have a sense perception of it if it really existed. So, we can conceive of something, he says, if and only if we could perceive it, if it existed. So go back to your computer and your perception of your computer. Berkeley is saying that you can only conceive of a distinction between your computer and your perception of a computer only if it's possible for you to perceive a difference between your computer and your perception of your computer. Well, ask yourself, could you perceive these two things, A and B, side by side? Perceiving your computer and then your perception of a computer? Berkeley thinks you obviously can't perceive these two things separately. Why? Because he says you can't perceive A, your computer, without having a perception of it. All that you can ever perceive is B, your perception of your computer. That's what he's saying in premise 2 here. It follows then that you can't even conceive of a difference between your computer and your perception of a computer. That's what he argues in 3. No such difference exists. And since your perception of a computer exists only in your mind, like every other perception, it follows that your computer exists only in your mind, like all other sensible objects. Whoa!